Now, one thing is crucial about this, in all of this, which angers me greatly because I'm angered not at them, I despise them, but I'm angered at my own people who, like fools, will kill each other over things that are not really worth fighting about, when there are all other solutions to the problems, and thus making themselves the common prey in their own fighting of each other of an empire. It's like the principle of the 7 Years' War. Get the other guys to kill each other, then you come in and take over the mess. That's the way the British Empire has always operated.
That was Lyndon LaRouche back in 2009, commenting at a forum that he spoke to, campus forum, on the question of the so-called Mideast crisis. We want to welcome you today to the LaRouche Organization's Manhattan Town meeting. Today, we're taking up a topic. It's called the Oasis Plan, a Westphalian solution to the, quote, Mideast crisis. And what we're going to be doing today is pretty comprehensive, so we're going to get right into it. To start us off, we're going to first play for you what amounted to essentially a full briefing that Helga Sepp LaRouche gave in about 9 minutes to the Schiller Institute at a webcast that she did earlier this week.
What's your assessment of how close we are now to a full-scale World War III?
Well, I think that the developments in Southwest Asia since last Saturday clearly have added one full dimension to this danger. I mean, what is unfolding in the so-called Middle East is a complete tragedy, and it is the developments which started 75 years ago, and ever since you have one step after the other on top of each other. Injustices have been committed. The situation which now erupted in the Gaza obviously has been going on for a very long time, and there are many questions which are completely unanswered. There are those who say that it is impossible that Israel, with its absolute impeccable intelligence service, should not have noticed this preparation by the Hamas. I cannot judge that. There are so many factors which I think need to be evaluated very carefully, but it is very clearly the case that you have now an eruption of a very complicated, very complex situation, which does have the potential alone, even without the Ukraine situation, to lead to World War III. The accusation coming from the Wall Street Journal, for example, and others, that Iran would have backed Hamas. I think that other people who are very knowledgeable about the situation on the ground clearly defy that and say this is absolutely not the case. But Netanyahu has made statements in this direction. If it would come to an escalation which would involve all the different groupings in Lebanon, in Syria, in Yemen, and eventually Iran and Israel would get involved in a war which, the unthinkable could happen, that would be the path to World War III. There is no question about it. The plight of the people now is unbelievable. I mean, on both sides, obviously. But what is happening now is the population in the Gaza, the head of the spokesman for the IDF has called on people to leave to Egypt via the only open gate in the border between Egypt and the Gaza Strip. But that is being bombarded. So what should people do? The UN Commissioner for Human Rights has said that the idea of completely making a blockade, cutting off the population in the Gaza Strip of electricity, water, food, and other life urgent necessities is a clear violation of international law. And it is collective punishment, which is illegal completely because it punishes civilians. Now, naturally, once you get into a long situation of injustice, cruelties happen on all sides. And the danger now is that a very bloody conflict will play out with the potential of going beyond the region, leading to a world. Because if it involves Iran, I think we are off the charts. So, I can only say it's a complete tragedy. It must be stopped right away. And I think it is very important to differentiate now between those people who say there must be an immediate stop to the fighting, whatever the terrible situation is, it must be solved through diplomacy. And those who say, no, we stand by the side of Israel no matter what. Well, on the first category, that's emphatically Russia and China, who have called for calm to return to the negotiation table. And naturally, it's all the leaders of the so-called West, including Biden, Scholz, Macron, Meloni, various others, who are saying, no, there must be unilateral support for Israel. But, that's not so self-evident. You can be for Israel, but what is Israel? If you look at all the leading papers today, they all call for the resignation of Netanyahu. They call for basically the opposition to rise. Netanyahu is calling for an emergency government of all parties, but it is extremely doubtful that all these parties want to do that, given the fact that the record of Netanyahu in the recent period has been one of, incredible internal strife. So being for Israel does not necessarily mean that you are for the present government, which may be ousted in a short period of time. It's very, very difficult to say. So I think if you look at the situation as such, maybe there are people who are such super duper experts that they can say exactly what is the solution for the Middle East. I can only say that if you look at the strategic situation as a totality, and that includes what's going on inside the United States, what's going on with Ukraine, the proxy war between the US and Russia over Ukraine, now the new situation in Southwest Asia, the tensions in other places, like, for example, the pending crisis, between the United States and global NATO and China over Taiwan. We are sitting on such a powder keg internationally that I think the only reasonable approach must be that all forces who are for peace agree that we need a completely new paradigm of international relations, that within this old order, which is, terrible and many things have gone wrong since decades, there is no solution. That is why my call of now more than, I think, a year ago, to have a new security and development architecture, which takes into account the interest of every single country on the planet. And that really means every single country and not just some. And it means that there can be only peace through development. Only if you change this present system, which increases the gap between rich and poor, and replace it with a new credit system, which allows for the development of every single state to overcome the terrible conditions in which many peoples of the world are living in. Only then do you have a chance to have peace. Now, I think that, that there must be a discussion about such a new security and development architecture. I think a reference point can be the Peace of Westphalia, which, indeed developed this principle that a peace must always take into account the interest of the other. This is the most important principle, And if somebody says, I only take care of the interest of the one side, you preclude the possibility of peace. And all the people who are so self-righteously now claiming that they know what to do should reflect upon that principle, because if you don't take the interest of the other into account, there will be never peace. And I think that, there is some hope. So I'm not saying that the situation is all bleak, even so it is very, very dangerous. But I think the hope is, for example, reflected in the new white paper, which China just published on the 10-year anniversary of the Belt and Road Initiative. And, I'm sure that this will be more prominently discussed at the Belt and Road Forum, which will start next week. It will obviously discuss the tremendous potential which lies in the idea of a community of a shared future of all of mankind based on development. And so there is a framework of resolving all of this. It would require, however, that unilateralism stops, that block building stops, and that we accept the idea that the so-called West must cooperate with the countries of the global South and completely change the axioms of their thinking.
If you're just joining us, we want to welcome you to today's Manhattan Project meeting of the LaRouche organization. Our topic is the Oasis Plan, a Westphalian solution to the Mideast crisis. You just heard Alcazab LaRouche, the founder and head of the Schiller Institute, who was describing aspects of the Treaty of Westphalia, 1644 to 48. Now, the actual origins of the tragedy that is now playing out in Southwest Asia are rooted in 19th and 20th century British imperial policy, whose destructive power and purpose has lasted for centuries. Now, only the human sacrifices that are going on now are new. The lethal axioms that have governed that conflict remain unchallenged to this day, to this moment, in fact. And if the proposed ethnic cleansing and de facto annexation of Gaza were to be carried out, it will mean the destruction not only of the Palestinians, but also of Netanyahu, of Israel, and actually also of NATO. As Lyndon LaRouche pointed out decades ago, when the British in their infinite wisdom miscalculate, world wars break out. And though that threat has sometimes been effectively exposed and wars have been postponed, sometimes even prevented, nothing has actually removed the danger of thermonuclear annihilation. In 2009, Lyndon LaRouche gave the following address we're going to show an excerpt of to the Middle East lecture series at Central Connecticut University in New Britain, Connecticut. He was invited there by Professor Norton Medzvinsky, and LaRouche's address was called The End of Sykes-Picot, Moving Beyond Colonialism.
I shall suggest that it is an error to talk about a Middle East policy. That is, I think, one of the reasons we have a problem with the Middle East. We keep talking about a Middle East policy. Instead of talking about a conflict in the so-called Middle East, we should talk about the Middle East in a conflict. And the conflict is largely global, especially within the context of nearby European and related civilization. This is demonstrated, especially since the British took over the Middle East, in a process which began with the development of petroleum in what is now called Kuwait by the British monarchy. And the petroleum development of this monopoly was to change the British naval fleet from a coal-burning fleet, at least the principal capital ships, to an oil-burning fleet. And the advantage of the use of petroleum as a fuel rather than coal was a decisive margin of significance for the British in World War I. Out of that, with the breakup of the Turkish or the Ottoman Empire, came a new situation in which the British, with their puppets in France, formed what was called the Sykes-Picot Coalition, under which the entire area was intended to be carved up between France and Britain as a joint colony. as such. It didn't work out that way because you had an able Turkish commander who embarrassed the British very much during the First World War, who defeated the British and the French and set up an independent Turkey, which he consolidated by proceeding to make agreements immediately with Syria in order to keep Turkey out of the Arab world, to save it from being embroiled in the Arab world, and who also made an agreement with the Soviet Union in respect to that border, and in that place created a nation state of Turkey, which, in a sense, has been a success. Not that everything has been successful, but that the existence of the state of Turkey has been a success, with all its peculiarities, which have shaped in its history. Now, if we look back on this thing and look at what the conflict in this region is, the conflict has been, since those developments of the late 19th century. This has always been an area of conflict. But people look at this thing and say, this is a conflict among this person or that person, and more recently, since the end of World War II, it's been considered a conflict between Israelis or Jews and Arabs, which is also not quite true. What we have to do is think of this area, as I said, as being an area within the world. The Middle East is a part of the world. The conflict in the Middle East is a part of a world conflict, not the other way around. But then look at it from a standpoint, again, of economics. What is important about this area, which we call today the Middle East? Why is it such a cockpit of conflict? Why has it been such a cockpit of conflict since way before anybody knew of a Jew in the Middle East? In the ancient wars among Egypt, among the Hittites, among the people of the Mesopotamia, and similar kinds of wars. Wars between the ancient system of Lebanon and its fight in the region. The wars of the 7th century BC, which involved essentially the Greeks allied with the Egyptians against Phoenicia, and the extension of Phoenicia in the Western Mediterranean being combated and controlled by another civilization there. So the conflict is ancient.
For decades, Harley Schlanger, who's with us today, has been involved in, as a LaRouche spokesman, and also just personally involved in discussing, debating, polemicizing, and proposing ideas concerning a solution to the crisis that you just heard Lyndon LaRouche give you the broader context of. Obviously, many people are agitated all over the world and looking at this, but they're looking at it, we would contend, the wrong way. They're separating it from Ukraine. They're separating it from the idea of the global war with Russia. They're separating it from the arc of history of the past century and of the past millennia. And you can't do that to understand anything about what's actually going on right here, right now in Gaza. If you don't actually decide to think about and open yourself up to the history, you are truly eyeless in Gaza. You're blind. And we're not going to allow people to be blind. We believe that there are no mysteries, there is only blindness. And to discuss the way out of that blindness, we have Harley Schlanger. So Harley? Hi there.
Hello. How you doing?
Great. You got the floor.
All right. Well, this will take some thinking for people, because it's taken a lot of thought for me to pull together what's been, in a sense, 30 to 40 years of work with Lyndon LaRouche. But this is crucial now, because how to achieve a peaceful resolution to the present crises, including Ukraine and including now the Southwest Asia, requires overcoming the axioms which have been reinforced by what is the disinformation industrial complex acting on behalf of the permanent war party. This disinformation industrial complex hybrid warfare machine has been supercharged since last Saturday to promote war as a solution and to force people to think they have to choose sides. And of course, the idea is that they want people in the West to choose the side of Israel and ignore the fact that there's a long history of a cycle of violence that's gone on, as you heard from Lyndon LaRouche. You can actually trace it back to the 7th century BC. But we're not going to go that far in what I cover tonight. But I want to start by raising just a side effect of this, which is that this is occurring as the Ukraine war is sputtering, and support for this Ukraine war in the United States and Europe is dropping dramatically. So now we have the shift to a different venue, the Middle East. It could have been China, but this brings up the whole question of what's behind this, which we don't fully know what caused the timing of this, but there are some hints by looking at this longer term history. But the whole point of the role of the media is to build support for war. The media is part of the military industrial complex, the collection of corporate cartels that makes money from war, but more importantly, uses war to reshape policy, to make sure that there's no break with what's called the unipolar order. And so they never tell what you might call the backstory, the real history. And we're going to take a look at that in this presentation today. You know, an example of this is the idea that the Ukraine conflict started on February 24th, 2022, when Russian troops moved into Ukraine. That conveniently omits the real backstory, which justifies the lies that Putin was unprovoked in launching the special military operation. It ignores what happened after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1990-91, when there was a promise made of no eastward expansion of NATO, a promise which was broken. It ignores the coup in 2014, which was essentially organized by the United States and NATO allies to throw out a democratically elected president and to bring to power the regime which is now committed on behalf of NATO to a destructive war against Russia. It leaves out the 2014 to 2022 period of attacks on the Donbass, the citizens of Donbass, and it leaves out the efforts by Putin to achieve a lasting peace based on a guarantee of security for both Ukraine and Russia. So when you look at the conflict now underway in Gaza and Israel, you have to ask yourself, did this conflict begin last Saturday when Hamas attacked Israel? Now, you can go back a long way, including to 1948 and the establishment of the State of Israel, and review the cycle of violence. Look at the attacks, the reaction to the attacks, the counterattacks, the revenge, and what you see is there's a cycle of vengeance. But if you also look over that 75-year period, what becomes clear is that winning battles in that cycle of vengeance or revenge has not brought peace. And the question today is, how does cutting off food and medicine and fuel from the largely civilian population in Gaza assure peace for the citizens of Israel, if in fact that's what Netanyahu wants? So the bigger issue is, how do you overcome the hatred? How do you overcome the antagonism which has resulted from the 75-year cycle? The only way to do that is to go to a higher approach, what Lyndon LaRouche and Helga Zepp-LaRouche have been calling the return to the Westphalian principle, the idea of no internal interference in other nations' affairs, and that in fact establishing relations based on mutual benefit, the interest of the other. This is something that was used in the 1648 to end 150 years of religious warfare. It's a tested principle. It's something which could have been done today. And what we're going to discuss in looking at this picture is how that could have occurred. But to begin with, I want to give you a little bit more of the backstory. And let me start by talking about the fact that the Biden administration has sent an aircraft carrier group, the USS Gerald Ford, to the region. He sent Tony Blinken to go and pledge full support to Israel. Defense Secretary from Raytheon, Lloyd Austin, did the same thing. Now, what happens when someone like Blinken goes into a country who says, we're interested in peace, defending the rules-based order, and that's why we're going to support Israel? Well, let's take a look for a moment at who is Blinken. Just a brief sidelight. And I want to do that by taking a look at his mentor, Madeleine Albright, what she had to say to justify the death of 500,000 Iraqi children due to sanctions from largely the United States against Iraq during the Iraq War. Can we have that clip, please?
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
The price is worth it. And we see sanctions across the world being imposed by the United States, killing children in Yemen, in Syria, in Libya. Now, Blinken is a protege of Madeleine Albright. I'm going to post up here for you to see Blinken's eulogy to Albright after she died in 2022. Can I have that, please? He said, Madeleine Albright was a brilliant diplomat, a visionary leader, a courageous trailblazer, a dedicated mentor, and a great and good person who loved the United States deeply and devoted her life to serving it. She was also a wonderful friend to many, including me. I will miss her very much. She believed that the United States must respond forcefully to dictators and tyrants. She created the Community of Democracies, a coalition of countries that defends democratic values around the world, which, by the way, is just another example of the hypocrisy when the democracies include the Zelensky regime in Ukraine. Blinken went on to say, Madeleine mentored a generation of diplomats and national security experts. I'm one of the many who benefited from her wisdom and encouragement. And in her post-state career, she dedicated herself to teaching, continuing to invest in our future diplomats and leaders. She loved this country, she loved this department, and we loved her back. Now, you just saw Albright justify the murder of 500,000 Iraqi children. So when Blinken shows up in Jerusalem to talk about how the U.S. is committed to protecting a rules-based order, one has to ask the question of what are these rules exactly? Because what we're seeing with the targeting of the civilian population of Gaza is a violation of international law, a war crime. The idea of a siege against a civilian population violates all human laws. Now, we can take up much more in terms of the background to this, and I'm going to give you a quick review of the backstory, but it's just important to keep in your mind's image Albright discussing why she believes it's acceptable to kill 500,000 children. Now, you saw a little bit of the LaRouche speech at Central Connecticut University. Lyndon LaRouche was intimately involved with crafting a plan to break the cycle of violence in the Middle East. He wrote numerous papers on it, and what he kept coming back to is that you have to get outside of the cauldron of violence, outside of the local eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth mentality, and look at where it came from, because what he said is that someone is playing with this for their own purposes. Now, what he identified, and what I've written about extensively over the years, goes back to the end of the 19th century, and you can go back a little further in terms of British history. But the adoption of a series of axiomatics for policy of the British Empire associated with the group of the Fabian Society and so on. And one of their intellectual authors, Halford Mackinder, who developed the concept of geopolitics, the merger of geography with political activity, which was essentially drafted as a defense of the British Empire. Mackinder's speech in 1904 laid out a conception of what's necessary to sustain control of the empire, the financial and trading operations of the British Empire, by maintaining the law of the sea, that is, that making sea power the dominant factor and stopping land-based connections and corridors. In particular, corridors that would connect Western Europe with the Eurasian heartland and also Western Europe with the Middle East, the so-called Berlin to Baghdad Railroad. Now, this is crucial because this was the fear the British had. They saw what Lincoln did with the Transcontinental Railroad to unite the United States. And their fear was that the same thing could happen between Germany, Russia, Japan, China, and even France and the rest of Western Europe, which would have left the British out in the cold. The British Empire would have been undercut dramatically by that. And so Mackinder's whole idea was that you have to prevent against alliances. Now, one of the strategies they had becomes clear when you look at what happened in World War I. The effort to pull France away from any relationship with Germany that led to the entente between France and Great Britain, the Entente Cordiale in 1904, and then the British role in funding the Russian-Japanese War, funding the Japanese side of it, to bring down Russia in 1904 and 1905, which ended up bringing Russia into an alliance, which became the Triple Entente by 1907, which was the basis for World War I. Now, one of the aspects of World War I, which affects the region we're talking about, is the ongoing decline of over about 70 years of the Ottoman Empire. And the question was, who would control it? Would the Russians be able to control it coming down from the north? Would it be under the domination of the Austro-Hungarian Empire? Or would the British be able to run it? And you had various operations in that period. But one of the most nefarious was the secret treaty that was made during World War I between the French and the British, the so-called Sykes-Picot Treaty, which was finalized in 1916, which carved up the Middle East, which essentially gave the northern part, Syria, Lebanon, to France. And by the way, that mandate for France lasted until 1946, although it was never fully controlled. And the southern part, which included Palestine, Jordan, and eventually the Arabian Peninsula, to the British. And so you had a dividing of the Middle East, which included using religious divides, tribal divides, and so on. Now, that, if you think about it, what's the importance there? That region, the geographical region, which is, we call the Middle East, but is technically Southwest Asia, is an interconnection point between Asia, that is India, China, the northern part, Russia, Iran, and the connection through Turkey into Europe and then into North Africa. It's a crucial potential corridor for trade and development, which also includes the maritime capacities of the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean. For the British, this was key to sustaining the empire, and that's what Sykes-Picot was all about. Now, connected to Sykes-Picot was the 1917 Balfour Declaration, in which the foreign minister of Britain, Balfour, wrote a letter to Lord Rothschild saying that the British intend to allow the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine. Now, what gave the British the right to do that? Well, that's part of the story. That goes a little bit beyond what we want to cover today. But that's the mentality of the British Empire, that they can control the land and make these kinds of decisions. And that's embedded in this concept of the rules-based empire. Now, once you know that, then you look at the situation over the last 75 years since the creation of Israel, and you see that the crisis, the cycle of violence, was embedded in the agreements going back to Sykes-Picot and the Balfour Declaration. This came to a head around 1948 with the creation of the State of Israel and the destruction of many of the Arab Palestinian communities, the loss of land, the refugee crisis that resulted from that. You then look again 20 years later almost to the 1967 war, in which Israel took major chunks of land. They took the Sinai from Egypt, which they later gave back through a treaty, but they took the Golan Heights from Syria. They took the West Bank from Jordan and parts of the old city of Jerusalem and Gaza. More than 1 million Palestinians at that time lived in those areas, which suddenly came under Israeli rule. Now, this led to the adoption of UN Resolution 242, which Israel did agree with and did sign, as did Jordan and Egypt, which called for the return of the occupied territories. And in return, these countries were supposed to recognize the existence of Israel, and they agreed to that. After the 1973 war, Syria agreed to that. But what happened in 1973? The so-called Yom Kippur War. Well, some people say there was an intelligence failure by Israel. How was it that the Arab countries were able to initially carry out a military attack on Israel? Well, is it an intelligence failure? Was it deliberate? This is something that was the subject of a number of commissions set up by the Israeli government. But think of the context for this. Post-1971, the end of the Bretton Woods system, a period of in between the fixed exchange system and the emergence of the floating exchange rate system. What happened after the Yom Kippur War? Well, there was an Arab oil embargo, and the price of oil went way up in Western countries. Where did the money go? It was recycled through Arab governments and companies into Western banks, organized at the time by Henry Kissinger. And this is something Lyndon LaRouche was very much on top of and fighting, because he referred to it as the recycling of petrodollars, and it became the basis of what some people call the petrodollar system. But most importantly, it provided the context in which a floating exchange rate could be carried out, which would then allow the Western banks, the largest private banks, to have a flow of cash which they could use to control economic policy. And that was something that Lyndon LaRouche addressed at the time by calling for, shortly after that, an international development bank to take the control of credit away from these banks and put it in the hands of governments so they could invest in physical development of their nations. Now, let's jump ahead a little bit from there. The situation in the Middle East remained unsettled throughout that whole period, from 1973 until the late 80s. But there was a recognition of some in Israel that the UN Resolution 242 and its follow-up resolution had the potential for a basis of peace. Is there a way to achieve an agreement of trading land for peace? And this came together when an alliance was formed between Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Rabin. Now, this occurred with the adoption of the Oasis Plan in 1993. But before that, the idea of an Oasis Plan came from Lyndon LaRouche, beginning in July 1990, when he gave a presentation. And if I could have the slide, I can show you some elements of it, What LaRouche said is one of the problems in the area is the lack of water, and that you need to ensure adequate water for all these countries. And so what he wrote is that you need canals, you need nuclear desalination, so that you could have water not just for Israel, but for Egypt, for Jordan, and for Syria. Now, this was something that was circulating widely, and LaRouche was talking with people in Israel and in the Arab world about. Now, what we see emerge then, after 1985, is a discussion process in Israel of how to achieve peace based on some kind of coordination, which would include the two-state solution, that is a Palestinian state and a state of Israel, but the idea that the Palestinian state needs an economy so it can be stable. And so you had Rabin in September 1993, when he introduced the Oslo Accord, made the following statement. He said, in order to convert the bitter triangle of Jordanians, Palestinians, and the Israelis into a triangle of political triumph and economic prosperity, let us build a Middle East of hope, where today's food is produced and tomorrow's prosperity is guaranteed. A region with a common market, a Near East with a long-range agenda. Now, this was part of the Oslo Accord. And what most people know of the Oslo Accord is the famous event when Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat shook hands at the White House in a meeting with Bill Clinton. And they think that the key to it was that they said, well, let's agree to have peace. Well, the peace was based on Rabin and Peres putting forward an idea which was in the Oslo Accord, in the economic annex of the Oslo Accord, that Israel would make sure there would be industrial investment for the Palestinians, that they would have improvements in agriculture, that they would have access to power as opposed to have it arbitrarily determined by what Israel wants to give when it's not punishing the Palestinians. So the idea was that this economic annex would ensure there could be peace based on the benefit for each side, that there would be an end to the war against Israel, the Arab governments and the Palestinians would accept the legitimacy and security of Israel as a concern for themselves as well, and the Israelis would recognize that security for the Palestinians rested with economic progress and development. Now, the problem was that this was agreed to, and Clinton made a commitment to this, the World Bank and the international bankers were not in agreement. They withheld the funds, so that what LaRouche said is you must start immediately moving earth, build the roads, build the railroads, build the power plants, build the water projects. It didn't happen because the funds were never allocated. And meanwhile, within Israel, there were attacks on Rabin. Netanyahu and his allies said that this is a violation of Jewish law. If I can find the quote here, what Netanyahu said is Rabin in this proposal is removed from Jewish traditions and Jewish values. And their rabbis in the settlers movement proclaimed the right to stop or kill anyone whose actions threaten Jewish lives. And they said the Oslo Accord is a threat to Jewish lives. Now, in this context, then, we see the agreement of Oslo did include a political side, which was the granting to the Palestinian Authority of governmental authority over the territories. But this was not to the liking of Netanyahu and his crowd. And the polemics against Rabin continued, that he was a threat to Jewish survival. And in November 1995, Rabin was assassinated. And that pretty much put on hold his idea of the economic development of Palestine as key to Israel's ultimate peace agreement. Netanyahu never accepted the idea of a two-state solution. And so the Oslo plan was never implemented. Now, this brings up something that happened in 2009, and I want to just read some quotes from an article in Haaretz, a leading paper in Israel, by a Hebrew University professor, Dmitry Shumsky, which many of you will find interesting because the view from the West is that all of Israel is unified behind Netanyahu and his policy. But what Shumsky writes, and this article is titled, "Why Did Netanyahu Want to Strengthen Hamas?" And he points out that Netanyahu developed and advanced a destructive, warped political doctrine that held that strengthening Hamas at the expense of the Palestinian Authority would be good for Israel. Shumsky goes on to say the purpose of the doctrine was to perpetuate the rift between Hamas and Gaza and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. This would preserve the diplomatic paralysis and forever remove the danger of negotiations with the Palestinians over the partition of Israel into two states. And he said that flawed strategy turned Hamas from a minor terrorist organization into an efficient, lethal army with highly trained stormtroopers, bloodthirsty killers, etc., etc. The point is, he identifies that this was Netanyahu's strategy, that the idea was you'll never have a two-state solution. And under these circumstances, what you see is what LaRouche was saying about someone is playing this from the outside. Now, the whole idea of Oslo was summed up in the toast that Rabin made in the meeting at the White House between himself, Arafat, and Bill Clinton, when he said, "What's necessary is the courage to change axioms, that the peace of the brave requires a change in thinking, a recognition that the cycle of revenge must be broken, but to break it, you have to create a circumstance where both partners benefit from the economic development." And that's what LaRouche had outlined. That was the whole essence of the political fight that brought in Rabin and Peres together. But the divide was not between the Rabin-Peres government and the Arabs. The divide was within Israel. And you had groupings, such as the grouping around Rabbi Meir Kahane and his followers, who argued that if necessary, the entire Palestinian population should be removed from Israel. Either they accept submission as second citizens, second tier of citizenship, that is, no elections, no right to vote, no say in the policy. If they accept that, then they can stay. If they don't accept it, they should be expelled. Now, Kahane was killed in the 80s, but this outlook continued. It was in the outlook of the person who murdered Rabin. It's in Netanyahu's government today. One of his leading advisors, his national minister of intelligence, his national security advisor, is named Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is a follower of the Kahaneite view, who is tied to the Koch party, which was Kahane's party, who has repeatedly talked about expelling Palestinians if they don't accept their second-rate status. This is a man who's a national security advisor, who's now meeting with people like Blinken to plan out the next phase, which, whether Blinken knows it or not, and I'm sure he does know it, is the use of this war in Gaza to expel more of the Palestinians. Ben-Gvir was one of the people who led settlers on a rampage through the Arab sector of Jerusalem and who did a romp through the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which helped to trigger the most recent uprising. So this is a situation which is set for an explosion. And this is where the outside hand plays a role in it. The only way to break this is through diplomacy and negotiation, which takes into consideration the security and the economic concerns of both parties. The same thing that is true of Ukraine. And it's not surprising, is it, that the same Blinken and Biden who are giving a go-ahead to Netanyahu to stampede through Gaza and drive more than 1 million people from their homes, that those same political leaders, including the European Union leaders, continue to say no negotiations for peace and security in Ukraine. That's the fight that we're in. And the idea that some people have that you can choose the more virtuous side and win a war that will force the other side to submit hasn't learned a thing from history, because that submission leads to increasing anger and rage, which eventually will flare up again. That's where the solution has to come from a higher peace movement. And that's what the Schiller Institute is fighting for. That's what the International Peace Coalition is proposing. That's what the Westphalian solution has in mind. And let me finish by just pointing out the Peace of Westphalia has been explicitly under attack by the same British faction that was behind Mackinder's geopolitics, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the Balfour Declaration, and the continuation of these kinds of conflicts around the world. That their view is that you cannot achieve peace. And what Blair said is that instead of the idea of a Westphalian principle, in fact, he came to the United States in 1999 at the University, or at the Chicago Council on World Affairs, and said we have to get out of the era of the Peace of Westphalia and adopt instead the idea of the responsibility to protect. That is, the powerful nations that are for the good, namely the British Empire and its American puppets, have to intervene against so-called authoritarian states on behalf of democracy. This is what the whole idea of democracy versus authoritarianism, which was, as Blinken pointed out in that quote I read you, at the center of Albright's policy, which goes back to Brzezinski and Samuel Huntington, who were British geopoliticians operating in the United States. And so this is the fight we have to overcome geopolitics. This is what Helga Zepp-LaRouche has said has to be at the center of any policy. And that's why it's very worthwhile to review in detail what LaRouche put forward on the OASIS plan, because it included a whole series of projects, which included a credit policy to invest in science and technological progress, to create a bounty, a new wealth that would allow future generations to live in peace and harmony side by side. So that's what we're really looking at in this crisis, and that's the only way out of it, to change those axioms.
Thank you, Harley. We're getting a lot of questions, and it's very, very useful that we're going through what we're going through. Actually, I was caused, as you were talking at the end there, you brought up Tony Blair, to be reminded of something that people have no idea about, which is what Blair is doing right now. Blair is the one that called for the end of the Treaty of Westphalia principle back in 1999. He's trying to get Clinton involved at the time in bombing Serbia. And of course, that was the first war of NATO in Europe, not the recent war with Ukraine, which is often claimed. But there's an article that was done only a few months ago about Blair. It's called From Inside Tony Blair Incorporated. And it talked about what he is doing now. He is the executive chairman of the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, which started in 2017. This is not his earlier incarnation, Blair Associates. This thing employs 800 people worldwide. It has offices in London, New York, San Francisco, Abu Dhabi, Singapore, and Accra, Ghana. But Blair's been involved actively in deployment in Rwanda. He has offices, consultant offices, and has been active in Rwanda, Senegal, Nigeria, Mozambique, Togo, Ivory Coast, Malawi, Burkina Faso, Sierra Leone, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And what he is involved in doing is the creation of what are called presidential delivery units. Delivering what? The idea is you got to deliver government. Government, and Harley will remember the old days of some of the, shall we say, mafia figures with which we became involuntarily familiar, who were often talking about delivering things. There are a lot of people who are writing in. I'm going to get to those questions in a minute. But I also want to reference the next step. This is something that was in our intelligence items from today. And I don't know if you saw this, Harley. You may have seen it, not had a chance to think about it. But it's a thing called United Against a Nuclear Iran. And this is a group which has been basically calling for going to war with Iran. Joe Lieberman from Connecticut, former U.S. Senator, had this to say in a press release on behalf of this United Against Iran group, against a nuclear Iran. Quote, without Iran's support, there would be no Hamas. Without Iran's support, Hamas could not have attacked Israel the way it has. Without Iran's support, Russia would not be killing as many Ukrainians as they are. Without Iran's support, missiles and drones would not have fallen on our allies in the Arab world. It is time to hold Iran accountable, while Israel must act to punish, weaken, and ultimately destroy Hamas, the critical military targets that enabled the horrific events in Israel are in Iran. We call on our government in Washington, together with Israel and our allies around the world, to launch strikes against military and intelligence targets in Iran, including the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps sites, missile and drone bases, and so on. Now, the point is, when you look at the advisory board of this organization, it's got on it Lord Charles Guthrie, who served as Colonel Commandant in the Special Air Services of the SAS, the Special Forces Unit in London, Sir Graham Lamb, Director of the United Kingdom Special Forces, again, Sir Ivor Roberts, who became the head of British Foreign Office's Counter-Terrorism Division, Baroness Pauline Neville-Jones, Lord Stanley Calm. Sounds kind of British, and I could go through and read them. Then, in addition, there are several people from Israel who generally are, for example, Meir Dagan, the general director in 2002 of the Mossad, where he served from 2002 to 2011. Then a second individual, Tamir Pardo, also director of Mossad, and so on. So now these are the people on the advisory board. It didn't sound too, there are a couple of, the Americans are Joe Lieberman and John Bolton. So I wanted to just call everybody's attention to this because, of course, they're talking about going to a war with Iran pretty much now. And I just wanted to know if you had any comment or any thoughts about this, what this represents, but more importantly, the broader context of the evolution of war that we're looking at.
Absolutely. This just proves what I was saying, which is that the approach of the military-industrial complex is to distort the reality to convince people that you have to choose the right side. Now, the idea that without Iran there would be no Hamas is a patent fraud. Even members of the current U.S. intelligence community have said they've seen no evidence that Iran had anything to do with the Hamas attack. More importantly, it covers up for the articles that have been throughout the Israeli press. Now, think about what I'm saying. In the Israeli press, identifying Netanyahu's strategy of building up Hamas as a counter to the Palestinian Authority. And what's the theory behind that? Well, the Palestinian Authority under Arafat was a national movement. It included all religions. It included a movement for the Palestinian people to have a unified state, a sovereign state that existed side by side with Israel. Instead, the clever idea, as the Professor Shumsky writes, Netanyahu's clever idea, was that instead create a religious movement against the Palestinian Authority. And there are the articles that have appeared in Haaretz and Yediot Aharonot and other Israeli papers, Jerusalem Post, op-eds have pointed to the fact that the Israelis not only provided money for Hamas, but provided logistical backup and support against the Arafat and the Palestinian Liberation Organization in Gaza, which led ultimately to Hamas winning the election there. So first of all, you have a patent fraud that's involved in this. Now, secondly, there's another aspect I didn't get into, but I'll just throw it out now because it's provocative, but it's worth thinking about. Why do so many American conservatives orient toward supporting the radical Zionist movement, the settler movement, which is behind Netanyahu? Well, this has a lot to do with a certain element of Christian fundamentalism, which essentially believes that you won't have the second coming of Jesus until all the Jews are repatriated in Israel, and then there's the Battle of Armageddon. Now, that's oversimplification, but it's identification of a grouping of Americans who tend to be politically conservative with the radical extreme factions in Israel. And that's who Lieberman plays to. That's what George W. Bush played to. This is a form of dysfunction of the American political class. And we see it in terms of the crisis in the United States right now. Look at the Republican Party. You have on the one hand Trump, who's far and away the choice of Republican voters to be the nominee for president, who's against the war against Russia, who's made mixed statements now on the whole question of the Middle East. He was quite strongly associated with Netanyahu for a while, but we'll see what happens with that. And yet the majority of Republicans are lining up to vote new amounts of funds, up to $100 billion more for the war in Ukraine, and who knows how many billions for the war to back Israel in the Middle East. So this, what you identify, again, is a proof of a complete rejection of the actual historical context of this crisis, and people blindly walking into a trap set by the military-industrial complex at a point when Americans are becoming fatigued with the support for the Ukrainian fascist regime. And by the way, note the timing again also. What happened 3 weeks ago? The appearance of a Ukrainian Nazi in the Canadian Parliament, which makes it very difficult to deny that there are Ukrainian Nazis that are supported by the Zelensky regime, especially when Zelensky was jumping up and down cheering at this guy because he was identified as someone who fought against Russia in World War II. So you have a breakdown of sensibility in the Republican Party, a normalization of the Nazis. And here's an irony. And this will make people uncomfortable, but you have to face it. What is Gaza? Gaza, in some ways, is reminiscent of the Warsaw Ghetto. The people who live there are, many of them, the vast majority of them are poor, have very little access to decent jobs. Now you have a situation where the food, water, and fuel can be cut off at a moment's notice by Israel. Isn't it ironic that the Jewish state, which was created largely to protect Jews from the policies of the Nazis, has adopted some of the tactics that were used against the Jews in World War II? As I say, this is provocative, but people have to think about these things because they're otherwise being stampeded into supporting something which goes against national interests of our country, but it also goes against the interests of peace and security. You can't build peace and security by carrying out a policy of vengeance, as Netanyahu has called for, against people who you identify as your enemy.
So we have a lot of questions and we have a lot of people on, and we also want to say to everybody that is on, we want to thank you for being here. Secondly, we want to put you to work, and we are going to put you to work because the program today the detail we're going into is there so that you can actually go out and act with the LaRouche organization. And you are going to make some enemies when you do this, and you're going to do, because you're going to have to do it now because of the nature of this conflict. And I'm not talking about the so-called Middle East conflict. I'm talking about World War III with Russia and China, of which this is part. That is all that is essentially going on here. It's more complex than what I just stated. In fact, any statement about these things in itself will be a simplification. But that's the process that's actually underway, and nobody should get bamboozled about it.
Dennis,
So I'm going to,
if I may say, if I may say something about that, to just go
sure,
back
please.
to what I said earlier. If you look at the 73 war and the effects of the 1973 war in moving the world economy to a petrodollar system, what's happening today? We're seeing a rebellion against the City of London and Wall Street, who are using, have weaponized the dollar over the years after 1973 to prevent nations from actually investing in their own physical economy. And now with the Great Reset and the World Economic Forum and these other kinds of policies, they're attacking the idea of sovereign nations, saying that sovereign nations shouldn't exist, shouldn't have a right to fight for the interests of their people. So in that sense, we're dealing with the same kind of economic restructuring, where we have a rebellion against the imperial colonial system, which is the BRICS, which is the emergence of the African nations and the Asian nations and Latin American nations fighting for economic development through cooperation and orienting toward the economic policies of Russia and China, including the Belt and Road Initiative at the center of that. And some of this is called de-dollarization, and people get all excited about that. But what it really means is that nations are saying we deserve a right to defend our own interests, not at the expense of the other countries, but together in mutually beneficial development, which goes back to LaRouche's Oasis Plan and so on. So if you look at this situation, the convenience of this war fits in with the idea of the Western powers trying to stop the move toward a new financial system. What happened at the BRICS conference in South Africa last month was the enlargement, which included Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Iran, 4 nations in this region who could be affected by a bigger war if the Israelis are not stopped. Now, that's significant because it does represent a potential to try to split countries against each other, break up the unity of the BRICS, force countries back under the control of the unipolar order. Now, that's just another element of the situation. But what we see from the recent speeches of Putin, for example, at the Valdai Club, the conference underway, the Belt and Road Initiative, the Chinese developments coming out of the last couple of weeks, the pressing ahead with economic development policies. So this is what you identified, the global fight between the attempt to protect a bankrupt system of the City of London and Wall Street and the corporate cartels against the potential for an economic order based on unity and solidarity among sovereign nation states for economic development against the green agenda, against global bankers' dictatorship. And that's why it's somewhat ironic to see how this situation is used to rope so-called conservatives in the United States back into supporting the war party, the permanent war party. That's another intent that I think was there at the beginning of the decision to use this situation to blow it up into something bigger.
Well, we're going to take our first question from John. This is from Savannah, okay? And he says the following: the U.S.'s diplomacy seems to be no more. We've transformed into the world police and now attempt to force our will upon everybody else, either through sanctions or militarily. This seems to me to be wrong and unsustainable. It will lead to a world war. How can the U.S. rectify this? We don't even protect our own borders to preserve our cultural identity. I'm a Southerner and redneck, if that's the preferred description, and proud of it. I don't understand our current administration's actions. The America that I grew up in is being perverted, and I have no say. Thank you. So, Harley, since you spent a lot of time in Georgia, this should be you're perfect for to answer this question, it seems to me.
Well, Georgia and the South as a whole, and developed a great appreciation for one aspect of the rednecks, which is the idea that we're not going to be told what to do if we don't think it makes sense. You know, the independent streak, what LaRouche sometimes refers to as the American reflex. Look, the basic point is that what John is describing is the sad state of affairs in the United States right now. But where does it come from? Well, we've had a long trend since the assassination of John F. Kennedy of U.S. government acting as the policeman of the world, getting in one war after another, including based on lies, on false intelligence, and so on. Genocide committed, the use of sanctions that are really unjustified under international law. And we were talking about Tony Blair a minute ago. Where's the accountability? Why wasn't Albright, who admitted that U.S. policy led to 500,000 Iraqi children dying, why wasn't she hauled before a court of law? Why was there no accountability there? And this is where you see the problem of the control of the narrative in the hands of a small group of people who have a vested interest. Now, how do you change it? You have to go out and fight for the truth. And that means you have to say what makes people uncomfortable, but not ram it in their face. You know, we're not there saying, you know, that we're against Israel and supporting Hamas. We're saying, take a step back, or better yet, take a step upward, higher. Think about the condition of mankind as a whole, and think about your responsibility to your fellow man and to the Creator to act in the interests of all mankind. Now that means you have to think. It means you have to allow yourself to get above these lower order thinking of revenge and vengeance and me. How do you think the culture of the United States has been destroyed? Instead of having people who can think along the lines of Schiller and tragedy to look at ourselves and say, where did we go wrong? Instead, we double down on what's wrong. So I think the question is well taken, but the answer is very straightforward. Join us. Become part of the Schiller Institute or the LaRouche organization. Circulate our literature. We have a call to action we're circulating right now. We have Helga Zepp LaRouche's 10 Fundamental Principles, which should be studied by every single university class on politics and history about how you resolve these kinds of crises. In law schools, how do we have law schools that turn out Blinkens and people like that, which have nothing to do with universal law, but the idea of a rules-based order in which might makes right. So join us, work on these ideas, and take them out and challenge your friends and develop new ways of communicating the urgency of a new renaissance as the only way out of the crisis. There's no simple solution. We have to change how we think, change the axioms. Rabin was right. Peace depends on the courage to change axioms.
Okay, as I said, we have several questions. We're going to continue to get to them. So if you want to keep sending them, we'll keep answering them. I want to just go to one thing though, Harley, because you mentioned this earlier, and I wanted to make sure we put it up on the screen so people saw it. And you referred to Professor Dmitry Shumsky. Now, who he is, so people should understand, he's the Israel Goldstein Chair in the History of Zionism at the Department of Jewish History and Contemporary Jewry. He's also and the director of the Bernard Sherrick Center for the Study of Zionism and the State of Israel at the Hebrew University. He has written various books between Prague and Jerusalem, Prague Zionists and the Origin of the Idea of the Binational State in Palestine. He won the Hecht Prize for the best book on Israel studies for 2011. So we're going to put up on the screen an excerpt from one of the articles he wrote and then have you comment about this. He said, this is all about Netanyahu. But the deep roots of the feasibility of the murderous assault by the Islamist nationalist phalangists from the prison that is Gaza on Israeli citizens should actually be sought in an earlier period of Benjamin Netanyahu's time in office as prime minister, prior to his criminal trial and his alliance with nationalist Kahanists and the judicial coup back when he was still considered level-headed and rational and responsible. That's because since he took office as prime minister a second time in 2009, that same Netanyahu developed and advanced a destructive, warped political doctrine that held that strengthening Hamas at the expense of the Palestinian Authority would be good for Israel. The purpose of the doctrine was to perpetuate the rift between Hamas in Gaza and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. That would preserve the diplomatic paralysis and forever remove the, quote, danger of negotiations with the Palestinians over the partition of Israel into two states, on the argument that the Palestinian Authority doesn't represent all the Palestinians. That flawed strategy turned Hamas from a minor terrorist organization into an efficient, lethal army with highly trained, dehumanized stormtroopers, bloodthirsty killers who mercilessly slaughtered innocent Israeli civilians, including women, children, and the elderly. This is solidly documented. Between 2012 and 2018, Netanyahu gave Qatar approval to transfer a cumulative sum of about $1 billion to Gaza, at least half of which reached Hamas, including its military wing. According to the Jerusalem Post, in a private meeting with members of his Likud party on March 11, 2019, Netanyahu explained the reckless step as follows. The money transfer is part of the strategy to divide the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. Anyone who opposes the establishment of a Palestinian state needs to support the transfer of the money from Qatar to Hamas. In that way, we will foil the establishment of a Palestinian state, as reported in former cabinet member Haim Ramon's Raymond's Hebrew language book Neged Haruach. In an interview with the Ynet news website on May 5, 2019, Netanyahu associate Gershon HaKohen, a major general in reserves, said, quote, "We need to tell the truth. Netanyahu's strategy is to prevent the option of two states, so he is turning Hamas into his closest partner. Openly, Hamas is an enemy. Covertly, it's an ally." Okay, comment, if you wish.
Well, part of that quote I used in my presentation because this is, as you just read that again, is a shocking statement coming from an Israeli who is making a couple of important points. But the most important point is the stupidity of this idea as a strategy. Instead of recognizing the common interests of Palestinians and Israelis in peace and security, it's developing a movement which will provide the opportunity to launch attacks whenever is convenient for Netanyahu and to prevent what he doesn't want, which is a two-state solution. So I think the fact that you have an Israeli professor of Professor Shumsky's obvious qualifications making the statement ought to cause people to think this is actually being discussed in Israel. Now, go back a couple months, actually maybe 3 or 4 weeks. What was happening in Israel? There were daily demonstrations of tens of thousands of people against Netanyahu. Sometimes on Sunday, there were hundreds of thousands of Israelis in the streets opposing Netanyahu's attempt to change the legal system in Israel to protect himself. You even had members of the Israeli armed forces and the reserves who refused to report to duty out of opposition to what Netanyahu was doing. So Israel is a highly divided society where there are many people. In fact, every time Netanyahu gets in, he gets in with a 1 or 2 seat majority, and that's as a coalition. And his majority now includes people like Ben Gvir, who's an open supporter of the racist policies of Meir Kahane. So if you take that in and think about it, you see why the idea of choosing to defend Netanyahu is choosing to continue war and chaos. And the fact that Shumsky points out that Netanyahu is funneling at least $500 million to Hamas ought to raise people's eyebrows a little bit. Now, at the same time, look what we're doing in Ukraine. We're giving possibly up to $100 billion to a war regime that has as a leading force within it dedicated supporters of the Nazi movement of Bandera, who was an ally and in fact, a collaborator of Hitler's SS units during World War II. So, these should cause people to get out into the streets and say, this has to stop. And I think when all is said and done, we're going to find that the Israeli society is not so unified in this policy of crushing the Palestinians in Gaza. And the question then is, can we come up with an actual solution? And that's why it's so important that people look at what LaRouche proposed. And I think we should put a link with this meeting today to his 2009 article, his speech at the Central Connecticut University, so people can go into the details of how LaRouche was thinking about resolving this.
Well, what we also be able to do, Harley, I know there's a, Jose may be able to figure this one out, is his 1983 proposal for a long-term strategy for the development of the state of Israel, which we can also put up. And we might even be able to find, if we can make people, we can inspire people to do it, his 1983 Saudi Arabia in the year 2023. People might be fascinated to see the depth and extent of Lyndon LaRouche's engagement on the question of the Middle East and resolving this conflict. There's a question from Gail Harley, which I wanted to ask and then reference something. She asks this: people argue that it is Palestine's fault for electing Hamas as their governing entity. Can you explain if this is true or not? And I just want to reference that back in 2005, Condoleezza Rice and others who were, I guess, trying to, well, they were doing various things, were insisting to Israel that there should be elections held in Gaza and the West Bank. And Israel back then was saying, that may not be such a good idea. And Condi said, absolutely no, we insist. The elections were held and Hamas was elected. An article appeared in the New York Times, January 30th of 2006, which started saying, Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice acknowledged Sunday that the United States had failed to understand the depth of hostility among Palestinians toward their longtime leaders, ostensibly, obviously, supposedly, the Palestinian Authority people. The hostility led to an election victory by the militant group Hamas that is reduced to tatters crucial assumptions underlying American policies and hopes in the Middle East. And it goes on like that. Just to comment on her question, of course, it's this idea they had it coming because they voted for Hamas is ostensibly, she's not saying that, but those kinds of things have been being said in public by others. So any comment on Gail's question?
Well, I think this is where we have to take some advice from President John F. Kennedy from his June 10th, 1963 speech, when he said that Americans should put themselves in the position of the people of the Soviet Union. And this became an ongoing theme of the last months of his presidency, where he was urging people to take into consideration the security concerns of the other. And why did this come up around 1963? Well, Kennedy understood that part of the reason for the Soviet missiles being deployed to Cuba was a reaction to the deployment of the US Jupiter missiles, nuclear missiles, into Turkey on the Russian border. And that was the basis for the deal that ended up resolving the Cuban Missile Crisis without a nuclear war. But Kennedy started thinking, what is Khrushchev facing in his own situation? A military which says, look, we can't allow the US to put nuclear weapons on our border, so we have to do it to them. And what did Kennedy do? He was urged by the military-industrial complex at the time to strike the missile sites, to take kinetic military action against the Soviet Union. And he didn't do it wisely. And instead, he started thinking about the concerns of the other, the mutual security concerns that he and Khrushchev shared, where they had hotheads and war hawks in their administrations who were pushing for action, which could have led to the incineration of the human race. Now, in that context, you then look at this question with Hamas. Why is it that people end up voting for Hamas? This is where you have to think about what would it be like to live in an area where you have no economic development, where you have, Gaza is a very small area with over 2.5 million people living there. People have lived there in many cases in these refugee camps, which is a polite term for essentially ghettos or concentration camps, where they've lived there 2 or 3 generations. Children today can share with their grandparents the fact that they are exiles. They had to leave their original homes and end up in a refugee camp with no hope. So if you have a hopeless population, it becomes a potential breeding ground for anger. And what happened was the Palestinian Authority, after the death of Arafat, had some problems with corruption. It had some problems with political leadership. It was not, they made the effort with Oslo, but it didn't work out. And after that, the Palestinian population, at least in Gaza, gave up on the Palestinian Authority, the PLO, Fatah, and thought maybe Hamas would be able to get a better deal. So that's why it's not difficult to understand how something like that could happen. But then to say that, well, therefore they deserve it, is taking a step into the surreal. No people deserve to be oppressed and subject to attacks, neither Israelis nor Palestinians. But the question is, how do you break out of that cycle? And you can't do it by staying in that environment. And that's why you need to have this ability to have empathy for the other. Not just, I need something better for myself, but my benefit can only be achieved at the benefit of the other. There can be mutual cooperation. That's what the Chinese mean when they talk about win-win. And this is something, which should be obvious for people who are religious. The idea of the golden rule: do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. And this is where you see the disconnect between the fundamentalist Christians who are cheering on the Israelis now to carry out jihad against the Palestinians, to return the jihad of the Palestinians, of Hamas against the Israelis. It's a break with the rationality of one of the central teachings of religion. So, the answer to that, when people are hopeless, sometimes they'll make decisions that may not be in their best interest, but make them feel better. At least we're trying to do something. And I think that's what you have. Now, then you can't leave out, by the way, the idea that Hamas was getting a large amount of money from Israel and support from Israel so that they could deliver services that were not being delivered previously. And that's where the whole, what Chomsky calls the Netanyahu destructive, warped political doctrine, accurate term for it. That's where it comes from.
Right. It also should be noted that, in fact, many people who were in and working with Hamas were, in fact, giving out food. They were taking care of people. They did do all of those things. It wasn't
Yeah.
that isn't the case. I mean, I'm not you didn't say that. I'm sort of pointing it out to the people who are watching because I want to make sure that we're not just trying to be so-called quote even-handed here. We're trying to tell an actual story. It's like talking about Algeria when the French occupied Algeria. There was an Algerian war. There was terrorism that was used in that Algerian war. That was a very nasty conflict. But the fact of the matter is that the level of oppression did allow for that to occur. I think what's important in the thing that we saw just last week is the timing and the fact that somebody took down Israeli intelligence. Either Israeli intelligence was complicit or it wasn't. But if it wasn't, who's the schnook that took it down? How did that happen? Right? It's like 9/11. How do these things happen in modern states? There's this question from Steve Harley, and he asks, would the Syrian leaders' 5Cs development proposal help to develop the entire the economy in the entire region? And so you would have to explain to people what the 5Cs development proposal is and what this refers to.
Well, I not can't remember at the moment exactly what that is, but I think it's part of this policy that Assad was putting forward for connectivity of pipelines, of rail, of port facilities, and industrial investment that would benefit the whole region. It's something that's coherent with the approach that the Chinese have taken with the Belt and Road Initiative. And I apologize, I don't know the specifics of the 5Cs, but it's part of this idea that you have to have a regional plan. There's no way to just develop a local economy. And the potential that exists there now, if these wars can be stopped, is the potential to extend the Belt and Road Initiative into that region with infrastructure, transportation, and so on. So I think that, the obvious point is that that's the way you get to peace. You give every nation a stake in the improvement of the conditions of their neighbor. And that's the idea behind the 5Cs plan.
Okay. I think that referred, I'm trying to do this from memory, it's the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, and I'm not sure of
the Arabian Sea, the Persian Gulf.
Okay, great, good, right. That's what it refers to, and it's an economic development program. We can do more on that. That's a useful topic actually for another program. So
it's
here's
good to
the
see
question.
some of our listeners. Good to see some of our listeners are on top of this situation.
All right. Well, okay. Here's so this is from Dahlia, and she says, "Hi, many thanks to all you to you for all of your hard work and intelligent discussion on a regular basis. Now, some people think that World War III has already started with the Ukrainian war, but it's actually against everyone around the world by the globalists. What is your thought about that?"
Well, whether this is a world war or not depends on events in the weeks and months ahead. Certainly, if you leave it to NATO, if you leave it to the Stoltenbergs and the Bidens and Sunaks and Macron, they have no intent to pull back from the confrontation with Russia. And the Russians are not going to submit. There's no way they can win this war against Russia. So in that sense, we're in an interim period which could lead to World War III. But the other part of her question is absolutely right. Where is the intent coming from? The Russians certainly don't want a world war. If the Russians really wanted to have a world war, they would have flattened Ukraine by now. They possess the capability to do it. They could start hitting Germany, start hitting the United Kingdom, which they have at times said if they continue to be attacked from them in terms of the delivery of weapons and so on, they may do it. But the Russians haven't done it. But the people who are pushing to make this a continuing war are the same ones now who are saying we should give Israel everything they need to crush their opposition in the Middle East. And that includes, by the way, as the Israelis are saying, not just Hamas in Gaza, but Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Syrian government, and the Iranian government. So where does this come from? This is the corporate cartels. This is the game plan of what some people call the globalists. But a better term for it is the corporate cartels that exist outside and above the power of nations, but have their tentacles into the governments. And you want an example of that? Think about the Federal Reserve. A lot of people don't like the Federal Reserve for good reason, but what's the Federal Reserve? It's essentially a bank that was set up to protect the interests of the private banks. It's controlled and owned by the largest private banks and financial institutions. So this is what the corporate cartels are. Big pharma, the raw material companies and so on. And they are committed to an idea of defending this order, this unipolar order, what the deluded Blinken calls the rules-based order, because that's how they make their money, and that's how they maintain their control. And that's what's threatened with the mobilization of countries to end the era of colonization. And this is something that's not being discussed for the most part, but in a sense, if you look at what's happening in Gaza, that's part of a fight against colonialism, because Gaza is, in a sense, a colony that's being sustained and controlled by Israel, just as many of the African countries that are now breaking, like Niger, Gabon, some of the others, they're breaking with colonial control to take over the control of their own nation, but in coordination with other nations. So the answer to the fight against globalization, or the so-called globalism, I think there's a distinction between globalization and globalism. Globalization is simply that you have a world economy. This is something that's an unmistakable reality. But what we mean by globalism is the idea of corporate cartels acting over and above the interests of nation states. And that's certainly the cause of much of the problem in the world today.
Okay, there's another question from John, and well, there's about 3 more questions we'll just take now. He says this: I have no problem with the Israeli military and the Hamas militants fighting and slaughtering each other for what they each believe to be right. But how can the Palestinian people, especially children, keep from being slaughtered? There really is nowhere to go within the Gaza Strip to avoid the fight. And as I understand it, if they leave Gaza and take shelter in a neighboring country as a refugee, Israel would not let them return to Gaza after the fighting settles down. What are the Palestinians to do? That's the question. That's sort of a question, I think, for us more than it is the Palestinian people. But see, what do you think, Harley?
Well, that's a legitimate question. When the Israelis say 1 million people have to evacuate northern Gaza, where are they going to go? Already the only shelters that exist, the UN schools and some of the hospitals, are tremendously overcrowded. The Israelis said they should go to Egypt, and then they started firing at the one entry point from Gaza to Egypt. So the other thing you have to consider is that many of the people who are fleeing to try and save their lives already fled to Gaza from the previous wars. And so they've been refugees for 2 or 3 generations. The idea of another generation or 2 or 3 of being a refugee is not very enticing. So the question then is, why not have a ceasefire, bring in the other powers in the world, not with weapons, but with a plan for economic development? And anyone who opposes the economic development will be the ones that you can isolate. But I think if you did that, you'd find that the vast majority of the Palestinian people would welcome that. They don't want to leave. This is the same thing, here in Germany. We hear all the time about the problem of immigration, and there is a problem. There are immigrants pouring into Europe, pouring into the United States. Why? Because the policies of the the war party and the globalists has been to destroy the ability of these countries to sustain their level of population. And so you create the incentive for people to leave without giving them a place where they can have safety and security. So the solution to the refugee crisis is economic development. It's simple. It really is simple. The fact that you have Harvard graduates who can't figure it out says something about the education they're getting at Harvard, as opposed to the difficulty of the problem. So the question is absolutely right. There's no place for them to go. You have to agree to a peace agreement, or else you're going to have more and more dead children. And then Blinken will have to have the same answer that Albright gave, that, well, this was the right thing to do.
Okay, Jeremiah says this: when Sykes-Picot was subjected on the world back in 1916, neither LaRouche nor the BRICS were available, or was an option for the betterment for mankind and the West. And the West was also the strongest force. That's not so today. What do you think?
Well, if you think about the context of Sykes-Picot, it was in the middle of World War I. And World War I was a war that was initiated by the British, but which foolishly was embraced by the Austro-Hungarian Empire and by the Germans. So there was a lot of terrible thinking strategically on all sides. What would have been the solution? Well, the idea that did exist was that you could have had the cooperation between France, Germany, and Russia, which was implicit in the idea of the Trans-Siberian Railroad of Count Sergei Witte, which had a great deal of interest from Germans who had the financial capability and also the economic and technical capability to help Russia to extend Europe into Eurasia. And that's what the British tried to stop. And the next attempt to resolve that after World War I, which, by the way, was a meat grinder, it killed millions of people over small amounts of territory. When it ended, the Versailles Agreement was designed to punish Germany, but also to isolate the Soviet Union. And there was an effort from Germany to remedy that, which was called the Rapallo Treaty, which was an attempt by the German Foreign Minister Walter Rathenau to make an agreement with the Soviets for German-Russian cooperation, economic cooperation. And what happened there? Rathenau was assassinated. Same kind of thing happened in 1989-90 with Herrhausen and others who were looking to use German capabilities to help upgrade the economies of the East Bloc and Russia after the fall of communism. Herrhausen and Rohwedder and others were assassinated. So the problem is, when you have a war party, you can have good ideas for peace, but you'd better make sure you mobilize to defeat the war party. And I think one of the things we're seeing now that is different is that what the BRICS are moving towards would essentially take some of the power away from the people who can have weaponized the dollar to maintain control. It doesn't stop the military-industrial complex in the West from threatening to launch color revolutions, assassinations, and coups, but it does potentially limit their power. And that's one of the ways we have to go. And look, on that very simple thing, we haven't really talked about it tonight, but there's a huge economic crisis brewing in the West. There have been numerous articles recently about the fact that the bond markets are being taken over by hedge funds, which means that the bond markets, which are usually a source of stability, are now going to be another part of a speculative bubble and will go up and down and will give you no security. This is occurring as we're seeing a contraction of the economies of Europe, and at the same time we're seeing that the tightening of credit in the United States has not stopped inflation. So this is where, again, we have to turn to LaRouche, the idea of Glass-Steagall, of banking regulation, the idea of national credit, not controlled by private banks that are interested in bailing out their debt-ridden clients, but a national credit system which is committed to developing infrastructure and new industries to provide opportunities for jobs and an increase in the overall physical economy. So, ultimately, we have a capability with this economic policy to use as a weapon against the speculators. But other than that, the difference between Sykes-Picot and today is no one knew about Sykes-Picot when it happened. Today, largely through leakers, through the internet, until the internet is shut down, generally we get to find these things out. Actually, Dennis, that brings up an interesting point. The leaking of a memo in the State Department that is about State Department talking points, that you're not allowed to do anything, State Department officials are not supposed to say anything about deconfliction or about ceasefire. The fact that this leaked within 24 hours, assuming it's accurate, shows the difference between today and the Sykes-Picot, where these guys could negotiate in secret and carry out their carving up long before anybody knew what they were doing.
Yes. Okay, we have a question from Zenat. It's kind of a two-parter, but I'll just do it. Will the USA and its war machinery benefit from this conflict of Israel and Palestine? And what is the benefit of accepting Israel as an entity, except for peace? And I think they mean except to keep peace or something. That Israel and its insatiable greed for more land can never win, can never be materialized. Okay, so that's what Zenat comments. Any comment about what is said here?
Well, on the second part, I wouldn't say Israel has an insatiable desire for land. I would say that the backers of Netanyahu want more land. This is the Greater Israel movement. This is the Jabotinskyites, who basically say that the Bible is a contract from God to the Jewish people to control the land between the Nile and the Tigris and Euphrates. So that's where the problem is. You have these Greater Israel fanatics like Netanyahu, like the Kahani crowd, like Ben Gvir and others, who not only want to get rid of the Palestinians, but they'd be happy to kick out the Jordanians, the Syrians, and others. So, that's the answer to the second part. In terms of the first part, what's the benefit of the United States? Well, the actual benefit for the United States would be for there to be peace. That's not what Blinken and Biden are aiming for. They're part of a belief structure that a delusional belief that the United States is strong enough militarily to impose what they call the rules-based order, the sole superpower, the hegemon. And what that means is the same thing that the British intended with geopolitics, that you destroy governments that don't accept the control of the British Empire. Well, that's what we're seeing with this new transatlantic Anglo-American US NATO behemoth. And it's not to benefit the United States. It has no benefit at all for the United States or the American people. It's not in the national interest of Americans to have wars in these areas, but it is in the interests of the companies that are part of this military industrial complex and the corporate cartels. And so that's the difference. And the sooner people figure that out, the sooner we'll be able to take power out of their hands.
We have something we'll put up on the screen because you referenced this, Harley, concerning the United States, the world financial bubble, but there's a very particular element about that with respect to the United States. I think we have a poster on this. Last year, the United States national debt grew by a record $2.2 trillion. On September 18th of this year, less than a month ago, the Treasury reported that the amount of money borrowed by the federal government to cover operating expenses stood at $33.04 trillion. At that point, it had taken the U.S. only 3 months to add the last $1 trillion to the debt. However, in just the recent 20 days, U.S. national debt again according to the Treasury, surged by more than $500 billion, now climbing above 33.5 trillion. This most recent rise at 25 billion per day puts the US, if that rate were not to rise anymore, at the level of adding $1 trillion in debt, not in 3 months, but in 40 days. That is, instead of rising 2.2 trillion per year or 4.4 trillion per year, the present rate works out as over $9 trillion. So maybe it's not a good idea to give $100 billion to Ukraine or other things like that. But what's your you have any comment about that?
Well, if you look at the total figures, the 100 billion to Ukraine is rather small. That's one of the points that some of the war hawks are making. But the same war hawks are voting for budgets and voting for policies that lead the Federal Reserve to pump huge amounts of money, not into the physical economy. If you want to do something about debt, and this is a simple point LaRouche always made, go back to what Hamilton did. Invest in physical economy. This is taking on a little bit of debt, but it ultimately means you're increasing the value added to the overnational productive capability. But if you're producing new debt to cover old debt, which is what we're doing, and then on top of that you have wars and you have, and it's not just the Ukraine war. We're trying to build new weapons that aren't working. The F-35 jets, the hypersonic missiles. We're spending billions of dollars on systems that aren't developing, that we probably don't need, but that money should be going to education, to healthcare, to projects which increase the general welfare. So, the figures you just showed, basically that's something that's unsustainable. You don't know when it's going to crash, and especially now they're issuing new debt in the form of treasuries that are now going into the hands of speculators, which means that ultimately, as the price of those instruments go up, they're going to have to pump more money in at higher interest rates, creating more debt. So, there's no solution in the present system. And the same people who are voting $100 billion for a war in Ukraine have turned a blind eye to this debt problem. I mean, it was useful that Representative Matt Gaetz raised this, but it's not adequate to just raise it. You have to do something about it. And that means break with the whole neoliberal policies that have dominated U.S. economic thinking, especially over the last 30 to 40 years.
Okay, I think we're pretty much at the end, Harley. I just want to make sure we do a couple of things and then come back to you for some closing remarks. I think we have graphics of both of those proposals that Lynn wrote during 1983 while he was also doing other things. You see on the left, a proposal to begin development of a long-range economic development policy for the state of Israel. So a proposal to begin development of a long range. So this was intended as a discussion document. And as you can see there, the date of release or publication was the 3rd of December of 1983. On your right, you're seeing a document which might interest you. It's called Saudi Arabia in the year 2023. That would be this year. As you see in the corner, it was written in June of 1983, 40 years ago. And both of those documents are more than urgent for today. In fact, maybe what the whole slogan should be of what we're talking about is that the world needs an oasis plan in Southwest Asia. That you can no longer sort of think about this as like the province of the Israelis or the United States and what they want to do, or of the British, or of other colonial powers for that matter. This is something that involves the entire world because it can be a hair trigger for thermonuclear war. And especially because, in a different way, because of the religious persuasions and interests of the people that think of Jerusalem as the center of their faith, namely Christians, Muslims, and Jews. It's essential a concern for everybody around the world in that context. So maybe the whole idea should be that instead of allowing anybody to go to war there, that there's an intervention and this idea of economic development and an immediate economic development, which, by the way, would be the fastest possible way to flush out the relevant terrorist elements. In other words, if you actually wanted to round up the terrorists, you actually wanted to deal with the problem, then that would be the way you would do it. The way that it will be attempted will end up in either a war of 100 years or 100 minutes. And the second one is going to affect all of us. So I at this point, Harley, if you have some final words or thoughts about what, and I also just let you know there are hundreds of people who are watching at the moment, which is nice, and they're I guess available to be deployed. So you go right ahead.
Well, let me mention a couple of things. First of all, we bring up these articles by LaRouche from 20, 30, 40 years ago. We have something called the LaRouche Legacy Project, which is going to be compiling a digital library of the writings of LaRouche, which would probably fill many, many bookshelves. But I think there's so many things he wrote about, so many things that were from the 70s and 80s were completely prescient, as you point out, the Saudi Arabia or the Middle East project. So people should be supporting the efforts that we're making for the LaRouche Legacy Project to make these incredibly valuable writings available, not just for history, but for current usage. Now, secondly, for people who are getting swirled around in the maelstrom of the day-to-day media disinformation complex, let me make two suggestions. One is, as many people know, I do a daily video update of about 10 to 12 minutes where I take the most recent events and put them into a historical context so that you can make sense of it. And you can use it to educate your friends, your neighbors, and this is available. This is for free. You can get it from the LaRoucheOrganization.com from a blog page that's there under Harley's Daily Updates. But secondly, a lot of the material I use comes from the EIR Daily Alert. The Executive Intelligence Review puts out a daily report which pulls together a picture put together by our analysts and writers. And I know, Dennis, you're involved in this several days a week. It's crucial intelligence because it's something you won't find from the mainstream media, from anywhere else. And so between the daily video update that I do and the daily alert, and the daily alert costs a little bit, but not much compared to what you might pay for for cable television. You're better off not destroying your mind and getting some useful information. Now, the other point is that once you equip yourself with the truth, you have to become a warrior for the truth. I often cite this Yiddish proverb, the truth never dies, but it lives a miserable life. And when I quoted that to Lynn one time, he said, well, our job is to make it less miserable. And that's what we have to do. We have to deploy our creative potential, our passions, our emotions, not into figuring out how to do something to make someone suffer, but how to uplift mankind so that we can have a new classical renaissance. That's what makes life worth living. That's what makes people happy, knowing that you're doing something today which reflects the best traditions of mankind from the past and is a bridge to the future for our children and grandchildren, so that we, instead of ending up in a nuclear war, actually have an interplanetary existence in the near future. So, join with us, join the Schiller Institute, become a regular subscriber to our publications. And I think that's the whole point we're making, that if you don't, you're subject to manipulation by this disinformation industrial complex, which doesn't have your interests at heart.
Harley Slanger, thank you for being with us today. I think we did a pretty good job of giving people real knowledge about the so-called conflict in the Middle East, which is really part of a global war. And I think we're going to be able to get people deployed as a result of what you said. Do we have the graphic of the 10 principles for new security and development architecture? We do. Very good. This is Helga LaRouche's proposal that she wrote a year ago. And I invite everybody to please take a look at this, because this has been the basis of the organization of something called the International Peace Coalition. This involves a number of different groups that come together, many of whom do not have agreement on many, many different things, but do agree that the urgent task of humanity as a whole today is a combining of forces and of interests for the purpose of world peace through economic development. So that's something for you to take, read, and consider. We're going to conclude today with another section from Lyndon LaRouche's address to the Middle East Lecture Series at the Central Connecticut State University in 2009.
Now, one thing is crucial about this, in all of this, which angers me greatly, because I'm angered not at them, I despise them, but I'm angered at my own people, who like fools will kill each other over things that are not really worth fighting about, when there are all other solutions to the problems, and thus making themselves the common prey in their own fighting of each other of an empire. It's like the principle of the 7 Years' War. Get the other guys to kill each other, then you come in and take over the mess. That's the way the British Empire has always operated. This was conscious, too, because remember that Shelburne's advice and counsel was the model of Julian the Apostate, the Emperor Julian the Apostate. What did Julian do which caused Shelburne to admire him so much? What he did was he abandoned Christianity. He canceled it, but not really. What he did is he put it into a kind of temple of various religions and began to play with these against each other. Now, Shelburne's conviction was, on the basis of the study of the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, was that the way the British Empire should operate was the way it had operated in the 7 Years' War, and the way it was to operate in terms of the Napoleonic Wars, and so forth, was to get the fools to kill each other, to play one against the other. Now, this is easy to do if you get people who don't understand the principle of Westphalia, the 1648 Peace of Westphalia. You don't understand this. Our interest as human beings is not to kill each other or not to engage in killing each other for the purpose of trying to get power over other people. Our purpose should be to set up a system of sovereign nation states under which each group of people has, using their own language and their own culture, is self-represented. But these nations, as such, so formed, must have also a common interest in the betterment of the general condition of mankind. The only thing that's worth fighting for is to prevent evil from happening to this effort, and to promote this effort for the common aims of mankind. Because the human mind is based on creativity, and because creativity is associated with the classical poetry, the best expression of classical poetry of a language culture. In order to evoke creativity in our people, so that our people may prosper and humanity may prosper, we have to promote the welfare of the other nation as much or more than our own. Because it's by promoting in them that which is good, which is creativity, which is the development of culture, the development of a physical contribution to human effort. That's what our purpose should be. Our purpose is not to compete with each other as such. Yes, compete in another sense, but not to compete as hostile forces, but to compete in doing good and sharing the good and realizing that we must develop our people's creative powers through the age of enriching the use of language, especially as typified by poetry and music, to think. And that should be our purpose. The problem, you look at this thing in the Middle East, you say, this is a disaster. What are these two groups of people going to do with this damn warfare? They're going to destroy each other. They're going to destroy civilization by spreading this disease. What are they fighting for? To kill somebody else? To eliminate somebody else? Or they're fighting to make their own people more successful as human beings by finding ways of cooperation with people of a different religious or similar culture. The principle of Westphalia. So we get so involved with the issues of the Middle East, which we find we can never solve. The way we're playing it, we'll never solve it. We will make efforts. Maybe the United States, if it had the right president, could force a peace with the support of other nations. But without some force, there's no tendency for agreement in this region. There's a tendency for perpetual killing. And what many of us can do is try to ameliorate that thing and slow down the killing rate, to try to keep it from spreading, to get them not to do it for another day. There are no guarantees. There is a solution in principle. And the solution is end this blasted imperialist system. And understand that we as a people must develop our spiritual culture. That is the creative powers of mankind. To carry further the development of mankind from some brutish character by a campfire 1,000,000 years ago or so, into mankind as we desired that mankind should develop today. That's the issue. In the meantime, we will fight. We will do everything possible to try to get peace in this area because we want to stop the killing. But we're not going to tell somebody we've got a solution that is going to be accepted, is going to work. We're going to say we've got a hopeless cause, and we're going to continue to fight for it. But you have to understand the problem comes not from these people, except that they're playing themselves for fools and fighting each other. They're both extremely poor. Do you know what the condition of the average Arab is in that region? Do you know what the condition of life is, the deteriorating condition of life of the Israeli? What the hell are they fighting about? Where's the benefit in the fighting? But the passions are deeply embedded. The habits are deeply embedded. We can try to impose the influence of restraints. Try to prevent these crazy Israelis from thinking about an attack on Iran, because that would be really a hellhole operation. In other words, we try to intervene through diplomacy and through other influences to moderate the tendency for self-destruction of peoples. But don't believe that there's some solution for the Israeli-Arab conflict. There is no solution in that per se. That's why I said at the beginning here, don't look at the history of the Middle East. Look at the Middle East in history, and there you find the solution.